Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Unfiltered. My name is Ridi Tlhabi. Now, tonight's topic affects us all, I think. Chapter 2 of the Constitution of South Africa contains the Bill of Rights, which is a cornerstone of democracy in South Africa. All people have a right to human dignity, equality, and freedom. The state has a responsibility to uphold these rights, and more importantly, judges are reminded to keep these values at the forefront when they execute their duties. Our post-apartheid history is filled with cases of citizens approaching the courts and securing decisive victories in their quest for social justice. Now, in a lot of the cases, at least that's my perception, and my guests will correct me if I'm wrong, it is the government that seems to be on the wrong side of the law. So how easy is it for ordinary citizens to access courts and, by extension, justice? Is money an impediment to access to justice? In other words, is it true, the perception that is held by many, that if you do not have money, you are unlikely to receive a fair outcome? Every day, though, contrast that to the social justice issue. Every day, we see politicians approaching the courts to settle political battles. Examples from the Democratic Alliance and Patricia de Lille in the Western Cape, to the EFF laying charges against Pravin Gordhan, and also, I must add, disgruntled ANC branches taking each other to court to dispute election outcomes or interdict a provincial conference. We saw a lot of this in the build-up to the ANC National Conference in Nasrec last year. So, tonight on Unfiltered, we ask, are our courts a battleground for political disputes, or do ordinary South Africans actually have access and recourse? Now, you too can be a part of this conversation on Facebook and Twitter using the hashtag SABC News Unfiltered. But first, take a look at this.
I heard that on the 22nd of November, we have to come here to listen our judgment. I was worried, because this judgment, it was not for only us as people from Kolobeni or people from Eastern Cape. It was just us affecting the whole South Africa. That's why I was thinking that maybe the judge from High Court, they can see that we deserve this right as indigenous people from Kolobeni. But now they can also protect, because it's going to affect the South Africa as a whole.
This court judgment says no mining without the community's consent. So that's a major victory for our clients.
To open a case against the corrupt former Commissioner of SARS and former Minister of Finance, now Minister of Public Enterprise, Pravin Gordhan, and his daughter.
Enough is enough. That if you want to argue with us politically, that's fine. But once you lie and you attack families and you propagate these lies widely enough, but you also start dividing South African society, then it is totally unacceptable.
So there's that distinction between political power play and social justice, or maybe the two are related somehow. We'll find out. My guests tonight are Umunyana Rujeje, who's the Deputy Director of Section 27. We also have Nicole Fritz, who's the CEO of Freedom Under Law. And in Durban, we have our former Constitutional Court Judge, Justice Zak Yacoob. Thank you so very much for coming on a Sunday evening where many South Africans are very excited. There's a historic concert taking place at FNB, but we need to keep these matters up on our radar. So thank you very much for joining us. Zach?
Hello, Umunyana, Nicole, and of course our interviewer and the country. We're very happy to be here.
Thank you so very much. So Zach, let me start with you. How do you define social justice, and how well are we doing as South Africans in providing that for our citizens?
Social justice has various definitions, but what I'd like to talk about is what is social justice in terms of our constitution. Mm-hmm. Because social justice will mean different things to different people. So social justice for us means dignity, equality, and freedom. It means the various rights, human rights and fundamental rights in our constitution. It means for us the right to property, the right to fair labor practice, and all other rights in our constitution, which should be fairly balanced to achieve a particular result. That's the first part. The second part is that you have to have somebody, some institution that attains justice. And in our country, it is the courts that do so. And therefore, courts are used in an effort to achieve that kind of social justice. So social justice for me is to achieve the kind of balanced and careful society contemplated by our Constitution.
Thank you so very much. And those are the ideals that we should live by as a country that is finding itself and that has such inequality and poverty levels. Nicole, let me come to you. Freedom under law. You have spent a considerable amount of time challenging executive decisions and certain appointments that you feel are pivotal to the edifice of our democracy. Let's just reflect a little bit on that. There was the Sean Abrahams matter, there was the Mhwebi matter, the Jiba matter, the Mdluli matter. Why did you preoccupy yourself with challenging these particular appointments?
So over the last few years, Freedom Under Law has taken as a focus looking at the criminal justice system and challenging appointments, conduct that we believe is inconsistent with the Constitution and the rule of law. We believe that the criminal justice system is absolutely critical to accountability, that accountability is going to serve every South African, and accountability is at the heart of the Constitution. And if you have these institutions, these agencies, essentially captured by particular persons who do not fit the criteria, they're not fit and proper, you're ensuring that prosecutions that should go forward, that investigations should go forward, aren't happening, and it means that and so persons who are being protected in high office, and it also means that ordinary South Africans who need to see justice done, who need to see investigations and prosecutions pursued, don't get that level of justice. So it has been a very particular focus of Freedom Under Law over the past few years to challenge certain appointments.
Am I stretching the imagination to think that there is a link between poor appointments, unlawful appointments, and lack of access to justice and social justice?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think what you have is if persons are placed in certain positions where, and they're there primarily to protect certain individuals occupying highest office, to ensure that prosecutions and investigations don't proceed in respect to those people, it also means that there are fewer resources available to ensure that investigations, prosecutions are not going ahead in respect of ordinary South Africans who are experiencing high levels of crime. And I absolutely think that there is a direct link between persons who are placed in particular office in order to protect presidents or other members of the executive, and ordinary South Africans not receiving the type of justice that they need to see.
So I have followed the work of Section 27 for many, many years, and I cannot help reflecting on some of the matters that you have raised. Everybody knows or should know the Michael Komape case, that little boy who drowned in a pit toilet. And it may be a story from the past, but the reality is the present for many children, not just in Limpopo. I can think of the textbook saga in Limpopo, and of course going back the history of Section 27, when we will still have the AIDS Law Council and Treatment Action Campaign, provision of ARVs, really civil society and activists just butting heads with the government to compel the government to provide ARVs. It feels to me, Umunyana, that the more institutions weaken, the heavier the burden on the NGO sector. Just take us into your confidence. What is your experience? What are you seeing in South Africa today as far as people's desperation to access institutions that will ensure social justice and that their rights are met?
Thanks, Ridi, and thanks for having me on the show. Section 27 works on advancing the right to healthcare services as well as the right to basic education. And the cases that you've described fit into those two basic rights. And we work on those rights because we believe that those are unlocking rights to other rights in the Constitution and allows people to participate fully in society and to realize their full potential. And so that's why we work on those rights in particular. But another thing is we have to look at institutions, state institutions, and we work with those institutions both in the health sector and in the education sector. For example, the Office of Health Standards Compliance is a critical regulator of quality of healthcare services in the country. And what we've done in the past is to work with them as from the time they were looking at legislation to create the Office of Health Standards Compliance, we were involved in a public participation process. So we find it's very important to participate as citizens, as active citizens in these kinds of processes so that at the end of the day we can approach those same institutions and ask for assistance on behalf of our clients. And you remember that we had the Life is Sidimeni arbitration. And part of that whole process involved the Health Ombud. And that is an ombuds that is related to the Office of Health Standards Compliance. And that office should be open to the public. And so the report that came from the Health Ombud actually enabled us to take all of that information and go into an arbitration, which was a quasi-legal process. And it was quite a creative process and an innovative process to get justice for individuals, but also to address the key failings in the mental health system, which is an area of the health system that is very susceptible to having budget cuts, and especially because people are especially vulnerable in that sector. Okay. And can't speak for themselves, and so that's where we come in.
We'll talk a little bit more about how ordinary citizens can access justice, and I think the one passion that I have now, how to fully utilize the provisions of our constitutions. We'll get to that in just a moment. Stay with us on Unfiltered.
Buildings, submerged homes and devastated families.
Biggest earthquake in here.
Their homes and buildings moved like boats.
Big shake, and I ran as fast as I can.
These are the satellite images depicting the area before the disaster.
The ground is like a wave.
I've never seen anything like this in my life.
It is unbelievable. You can actually smell the stench of dead bodies around.
The National Hurricane Center said earlier on Tuesday that Michael was a Category 1 storm with sustained winds of up to 150 kilometers per hour. Residents were implored to get out of harm's way ahead of life-threatening waves, winds and rains. Flash flooding over the weekend caused 13 deaths in Central America after Michael formed off the coast of northern Honduras.
We pride ourselves on being impartial as well as independent. On the agenda, we basically break down the stories of the day.
Give the viewer the assurance that we will cover every side of the story.
Tear gas has now been also thrown at the protesters.
We are peacefully marching and the police is stopping the people. They're hitting the people. We are spraying the people with pepper spray. These people are supposed to protect us, but they are against us.
We are pushing them back by using the rubber bullets because we cannot allow them to block the roads and damage other people's property.
Quite important to bring on board all sides and hear what everybody has to say about the story, especially being the public broadcaster.
All in all, we basically take the news agenda of the day forward.
Welcome back. You are watching Unfiltered, and tonight I'm with Umunyana Rujeje, who's the Deputy Director of Section 27. We have Nicole Fritz, the CEO of Freedom Under Law, and of course, in our Durban studios, our guest is Justice Zach Yaqub, who's a former Constitutional Court judge. In the first segment, we defined social justice. We talked about the crucial matter of credible appointments to state institutions so that South Africans really get to enjoy the benefits that come with those institutions and the laws that pertain to that particular sector. And then I do want to get into the Constitution and how we reflect on the Constitution. And Zach, I want to bring you in here on the Constitution. Very often when a judgment goes against power, in this case political, criticism is directed at judges and the courts, that they are not transformed, that there is judicial overreach, or whatever you may call it. But if we were to reflect on our Constitution and what it enjoins us to do, are you satisfied with the level of seriousness and regard that decision makers have for our Constitution? Let's start with that.
Okay, our Constitution makes it quite clear that it is supreme, and everything inconsistent with it is invalid rather. All law or conduct inconsistent with the Constitution is invalid. Now, someone has to decide whether the government acts consistently with the Constitution or not. And our Constitution makes it clear that it is the courts who decide that question, and it is the Constitutional Court which is the final arbiter. You can't have the government deciding whether what it does is correct or not. You can't have Parliament deciding on what it does is correct or not. You have to have an independent arbiter. And that is what courts really are. So complaints about abuse of power and so on are quite complicated because they tend to imply in a way that somehow the government can decide what is constitutional. That's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is that it is not the duty only of judges to ensure that constitutional values are properly employed and properly asserted in every respect. It is the duty of government as well. It is the duty of all of us. And the pressure on courts increases only because governments don't do things properly. There was a time in 1994, for the first 5 or 6 or 7 years of our democracy, where our Constitution was regarded as important, where the values of our Constitution were often talked about, and where the values of our Constitution were carefully taken into account in the implementation of government measures. The problem now is that the Constitution is hardly ever respected and protected, hardly ever mentioned in political circles, hardly ever mentioned in Parliament, up until recently hardly ever mentioned in presidential addresses, hardly ever mentioned in what government ministers have to say. So ultimately, until and unless government, people in government and members of Parliament begin to seriously look at the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and begin to understand it, we are going to get nowhere. The Constitution is not for lawyers alone. It is for everybody. In fact, and I wonder, for example, how many members of Parliament know about the Bill of Rights? But I'm done. Thanks.
But Zach, I can't help reminding you of something that happened when we had the Speaker of Parliament, who was the chairperson of the ANC, saying on television that the Constitution is not supreme, it's just a mere guideline. So when you have people in such important leadership literally just disregarding this sacrosanct law, then it explains a lot of the inequality that we're seeing in society. It explains a lot of the violation of people's rights that we're seeing in society. Your comment on that?
That's absolutely right. It's not actually the Speaker. It is everybody. It is the ANC, the political party in power, which disregards the Constitution and refers to it only when it suits it. The DA does that too, frankly. They don't agree with the affirmative action values of the Constitution, and so do many, many other political parties. They have no clear idea of what to do. They behave, all our political parties, subject to maybe one or two exceptions, but certainly the major ones, behave in an opportunistic and dishonest fashion, unconstitutional fashion. They do not understand the Constitution, they don't know it in the least, and they don't care about it. All that they are interested in is their own opportunistic conduct and their own greatness.
We'll talk about that in just a moment, because the irony, of course, is that when they're having their own political disputes, they run to the very courts that they accuse of overreaching, the very judges that they often criticize as being part of a certain agenda. Zach spoke about the pressure on courts, and I was trying to decide. I was a bit ambivalent about that. There was a bit of excitement in South Africa as we saw the Constitutional Court ruling on Nkandla. I saw many people on social media saying, I think many young South Africans will be attracted to the legal profession as you see the Constitution and the law coming to life. That's a good thing in that our laws are being tested and boundaries are being set. Example, the powers of the public protector, because the ANC and Parliament and Mr. Jacob Zuma had claimed that, she doesn't have the power, even though they didn't review her report. So the point here is our laws are being tested, which is a good thing. But at the same time, we have to reflect on the pressure that is being put on the courts because state or government institutions are not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and I think that that's exactly right, that one has to be mindful of this almost unprecedented burden that has been placed on the courts as a result of bad governance. This idea, I mean, of course it is for the judiciary to be the arbiters, but this idea that the executive and the legislature are somehow free to kick the constitutional football around, that they're not similarly enjoined to uphold the values, is anathema. And this idea, I mean, we know that the judiciary is the most vulnerable branch. It has been famously termed the least dangerous branch. It doesn't control a sword or a purse. It actually depends on the other branches for the implementation of those rulings. So it is incredibly, it is fragile, perhaps the most fragile of the branches in government. And the idea that it should have to shoulder such an incredible burden over the last few years because proper constitutional decisions have not been taken at the level of the legislature and at the executive, and because political parties somehow feel that they're free to make expression, to engage in action that is not consistent with the values of our Constitution, places the judiciary and places our Constitution under incredible pressure. And I think that that is something for us as South Africans to be very concerned about. I mean, this piece of paper, as progressive as the values are enshrined therein, it in itself is not going to realize it. It doesn't have the power to realize itself. It depends on us. Particularly if we enjoy high office, but every South African actually to implement the values that are enshrined therein.
And Munyana, I mean, you come from the NGO sector. You have taken on such mammoth tasks, such huge battles against the government. And the perception that the courts are constantly ruling against the government. I think they are ruling against the government with good reason. But let's just debunk one myth. You don't win every case that you bring before the courts. In fact, I'll use the Komape case because certain desires or goals of that litigation were not fully achieved.
Right. And that case has gone on appeal. We certainly don't win all the cases that we bring, but we do choose very carefully which cases to bring. And in fact, what we do in conjunction with going to court is to educate communities. So what's important about what's being discussed now is that the Constitution belongs to everyone. It belongs to all of us. And what we do is we go out into communities and in places where we work, and we do workshops around what the Constitution means. What is the Bill of Rights? What does it mean for you in the context of your school, your child's school? What does it mean in the context of you going to a clinic? What should you expect? What can you demand? I think it's really important for us to talk about that, because without the power of the people, we cannot hold power to account.
Yes.
And we try to do that by going to court as an additional tool that we have in our toolbox. And we do bring cases against the state, but we also go up against the private sector, because we believe that the private sector sometimes has more power in instances than the state does. And so what we do is not to be anti-government or to go after government for the sake of it, but to ensure that the obligations that the government has, in particular issues around health and basic education, are met, and that people are the ones demanding. We, as public interest lawyers, are merely a tool for the communities that we represent.
And I think that's very important, because it's very easy for the discourse to be manipulated. I refer again to an elective conference of a particular party where a presidential hopeful said that oppositions can't win elections at the ballot, but they're trying to run the country via the courts. And I thought, well, if the state was doing the right thing, then it would not need to be taken to court, and if it were taken to court, then it would win its cases. So let's pause and take a break. When we return, then we will try to debunk some of the myths, as well as talk about the often repeated criticism of the court, judicial overreach. What does it mean, and is it true? Stay with us.
They say cricket is boring. Bontate Joma, you and your friends, all of this sweet bowling, and all this music. Thank you, LKG.
Come on, Nana. We're in mood.
They say cricket is boring. This is T20 cricket like we've never seen it before.
Fast, fun for all. The Mzansi Super League. Live on SABC 3 and SABC Radio.
To be a part of something like this makes me proud, and I think that to be able to report the news in a fair, just, independent and impartial way is what the public broadcaster stands for.
Fashion, travel, music, food, and food. Did I mention food?
We at Trends Travel love bringing you cuisines from around the world.
Forbes US have declared Gabon the coolest city destination to visit in the world for 2018-2019.
You know, as designers, we're always setting trends and also doing like high fashion. So it was quite nice to come and see the ready-to-wears every day.
Welcome back. My guests tonight are Umunyana Rujeje, who's the Deputy Director of Section 27, Nicole Fritz, the CEO of Freedom Under Law, and in our Durban studios, our guest is Justice Sak Yaqub, and of course, he is a former Constitutional Court judge. So let me remind you of what we are talking about. We're talking about access to the law, access to justice, and we've seen politicians themselves criticizing the courts, but then running to the same courts to settle political scores. So we are asking, are our courts the battleground for political disputes? And do South Africans have equal access to the courts and to recourse? And of course, we're finding out some of the cases that were taken up by Freedom Under Law, by Section 27, and I think fighting for the ordinary citizen. And then, Nicole, I'd like to bring you in. The Sean Abrahams matter is the one that is most interesting and fascinating for me. Of course, we've had the interviews and the hearings. We are going to get a new head of the NDPP soon. But the criticism directed towards Freedom Under Law, and I'm sure Section 27 has felt the same kind of heat, is that you're trying to instruct the president on his appointments. He's got a right to appoint whoever he wants to appoint. And the word that was used and often abused would be prerogative. Are you trying to control the president?
No. And the case, I mean, the case which resulted in this judgment.
Let's remind our viewers what the judgment.
So the judgment was we had challenged the golden handshake that had been granted to the former National Director of Public Prosecutions, Mr. Nkosana, in the amount of 17 million rand. And we held that that was unacceptable, that there are particular provisions which regulate when the NDP is to step down from his post. In fact, what happened during that case is that Mr. Nkosana helped Freedom Under Law and Corruption Watch with information which had been withheld by the presidency, which made it clear that he had not wanted to vacate his post, that he was essentially pressurized to do so, that he was not seen as sufficiently pliable by former President Zuma, that he was not doing his bidding. That judgment resulted in the order that the settlement granted him was invalid and was to be set aside, but that as his vacating the office was unlawful, that the subsequent vacancy was also hadn't been created, and so the subsequent appointment of Mr. Sean Abrahams was itself invalid and to be set aside. And there was then an order that the president appointing new National Director of Public Prosecutions within 90 days. So that was the judgment. It didn't say who the president should appoint, and we have certainly not made any statement as to who we believe the president should appoint. We have watched the interview proceedings with interest. We have believed that those interview proceedings, and we think the president was wise to not merely appoint the next National Director of Public Prosecutions on his own, but to appoint a panel and to ensure a more consultative, participative process. We have watched those with interest. We believe the fact that they were public, that the public was able to scrutinize those interviews is very important, allowing a return of confidence to the National Prosecuting Authority. And I think that that's incredibly important. If the public is to trust the National Prosecuting Authority to act in accordance with their wishes, their understanding of justice, and we need to see that happen. So that there's been no statement on the part of Freedom Under Law as to who should be appointed.
And I think I do want to emphasize that even if it is the president's prerogative to make appointments or to do this, the fact of the matter is, as Zach said, his decisions, his exercising of his duties must be within the boundaries, the confines of the law. I do want to spend a moment just debunking or confirming certain perceptions and certain beliefs. Zach, I'll come to you this time. This whole notion of judicial overreach, what do you make of it? And as a former judge who couldn't get into a public spat with politicians who were criticizing the courts, sometimes unfairly, how did it make you feel when they would direct such venom, I think, at the courts? It's still happening this time around, but now you're a retired judge. I'm sure you're free to speak.
No, of course I am. I had no trouble with it at all. I understood completely that everybody who has judgments against them will complain. And I'm a member of the board of Section 27 and of FUL. Oh. And both these organizations complain when they lose cases too. So it's quite a normal phenomenon. So of course judges will be criticized by a whole range of people. What we've got to do is maintain the course and do it properly. So for me and for the majority of judges in our country, those criticisms are always par for the course. We do what we want to do, we do what we have to do, we do things to the best of our ability, and that is the end of that. Many people say that we try to please certain quarters at different times and so on, but that never happens. What the majority of members of the bench do is study what they have to study, evaluate what they have to evaluate, and do things in terms of the law and the Constitution openly and properly.
And I think a lot of us... Sure, carry on.
So I don't think that we get tense at all, yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are comfortable with criticism directed or people reacting because these are life and death matters, sometimes emotional matters. That's okay, but the danger comes when the judiciary is depicted as the enemy of the state or being participants in some sort of regime change. That's when it gets a bit dangerous. But Umanyana, I just want to talk about what happens behind the scenes. A lot of South Africans, rightly so, believe that if you don't have access to money, to finances, you can't approach the courts. But you have represented some of the most downtrodden members of society. But I suppose what we don't speak about are the many cases that you can't take because you don't have capacity, because you don't have finances. Tell us about that. What happens if you are poor in South Africa and you have been wronged?
You know, it's a difficult situation for a lot of those people, and we are a very small organization. We're a donor-funded organization, so we raise funds to be able to run cases. So we work on a pro bono basis for all of our clients. We don't take any money from the public, but that means that we have to then ration those resources. And what we do, as I said, is to take the strategic cases that will have an impact on the system, and the overflowing impact should flow to the people on the ground who are in similar situations. So, for example, when we do a case on accessing healthcare services, medicines, for example, we may do so on behalf of a particular group, like the Treatment Action Campaign. Those people have access because all of the members of the Treatment Action Campaign have access because of what access has been unlocked by the case. But so does the rest of the country that is in the same situation. But indeed, people do call our offices as well and do write to us on Facebook and ask for help. And often we are able to help individuals as well. We employ 2 paralegals whose only job is to respond to those individual requests for assistance. So very often at a particular time of the year, there'll be questions around getting a child into school who doesn't have a birth certificate or whose parents don't have an ID. And our paralegals will get onto those cases and ensure kids have access to those schools. Or if a pregnant woman is not able to access services at a hospital with a complicated case, we will intervene from that perspective. So it's really a balance of being able to be available to the public, but also to strategically bring cases that have a huge impact for the majority of people in South Africa.
And Nicole, I know you didn't work on this particular case, but just your general thoughts. I mean, it was a historic case, the Kolobeni matter, and I think for many of us, what it reminded us of is that the power of the citizen, and that we can exercise our agency, and that the government does have to consult people who are affected by its decisions. And I think that was a beautiful moment, although it came at a great cost. There were some assassinations, some intimidation, but it's worth noting it for its significance. Absolutely, absolutely. And this is about, you know, ensuring that these values that we talk about in our constitution of human dignity, of freedom and equality have real meaning. And it's these types of cases that actually realize them and make them have practical meaning, not just beautiful sounding terms and phrases that, you know, populate our constitution. So absolutely. When we come back, I want to talk about politicians going to the courts. And Minyana, you just told us that the funds are often not available. So it's particularly exasperating when you see politicians wasting money settling political scores. It's becoming a culture. I think, I mean, they've got protection as well under the constitution, but how much of it is genuine and legitimate, and how much of it is abuse of authority and taxpayers' money, really. Stay with us.
SABC is independent and impartial, and it's important that as we deliver the news, we do so without fear, without favour, without prejudice, and that we ensure that we get the multiplicity of views so that our stories and coverage is balanced.
We pride ourselves on being impartial as well as independent. On the agenda, we basically break down the stories of the day, give it more substance and give it more detail. So all in all, we basically take the news agenda of the day forward.
But more than that, we'll be able to reflect the stories of ordinary folk, people who are trying to make ends meet, facing the most incredibly difficult obstacles and circumstances, and that they will find that their realities are expressed on the SABC.
To be a part of something like this makes me proud, and I think that to be able to report the news in a fair, just, independent and impartial way is what the public broadcaster stands for.
On Media Monitor, we leave no stones unturned.
We don't have shared principles when it comes to media freedom.
From the integrity of journalists to accusations of fake news.
If anybody comes with an alternative view, he starts referring to it as fake news.
We also look at the safety of our journalists while covering stories on the field.
This is something that we're faced with daily, from journalists who say they've been physically or verbally attacked by community members.
Watch Media Monitor Sundays at 9 a.m. We at Network explore all things technological.
The modern battlefield is the battlefield of the mind, and the tools for affecting the mind are social media.
We look at how technology advances medicine and education.
Children can learn up to 60% more information in a shorter condensed amount of time using virtual reality as a medium for instruction.
From music, gaming, even computer-generated supermodels. Be a part of our network Saturdays at 8:30 p.m. and Sundays at 5:30 p.m.
Welcome back. You're watching Unfiltered. My guests tonight are Umunyana Rujeje, who's the Deputy Director of Section 27. We have Nicole Fritz, the CEO of Freedom Under Law, and of course, in our Durban studios, former Constitutional Court Justice Zach Yakub. So we are talking about access to justice, access to courts. We are talking about social justice and whether ordinary South Africans have the same power, the same freedom to approach the courts and enjoy the justice and the rights that are enshrined in our Constitution. Of course, our Constitution says they do, but in practice and in reality, it sometimes doesn't happen. And that's why you've got organizations such as Section 27 and Freedom Under Law to ensure that you as a South African have a voice. They can't take every single case under the sun. But I think as we talk about the limitations and restrictions, we ought to cast our eyes on the state and ask, is the state acting according to the provisions of the Constitution? Are they fulfilling their constitutional duties? And when they don't fulfill their constitutional duties, what should happen? Well, we had a president who was found to have violated the Constitution by the Constitutional Court, but life just went on. It often feels as if the politics trump constitutionalism. And Zach did say in our introduction that he doesn't believe that many of these leaders do actually respect the Constitution. Zach, let me go to you here. A certain former president appeared in court in a case that has been dragging for over a decade. This happened 2 days ago, and on the steps of that particular court, he was chanting and talking to his supporters and saying that this case has nothing to do with justice or criminality. It is about people who want to control the economy, and therefore they are prosecuting him. I'm using that as a case study because he's not the only person who would often question the reason behind the prosecution. You're a judge, just educate the nation here for just a moment. Does it matter what the intentions of the prosecutions are? In other words, if a defendant or the accused believes that there is malice behind a particular decision, why does that often seem to be the topic rather than is there merit to the accusations and to the charge? Your thoughts?
I agree with you completely that there can only be malice if there is no basis for the prosecution to be brought. If there is a basis for the prosecution to be brought, and if there is evidence, then there is no reason to object to the prosecution being brought. Let's give you a very, very simple example. Let us assume that I was your enemy and you killed your husband. If I saw you killing your husband, the fact that I am your enemy has nothing to do with it. If I saw you kill your husband, I saw you do it, and that's the end of that. That's the graphic example I can give about the difference between those two things. The motive is absolutely irrelevant. The only issue is, did what the state say happened? Happened. And it has become the fashion to try and decide these questions in advance, before the case itself. And I wish that courts would put their foot down slowly and say, we will decide these cases in the course of the case itself. We take too many cases and too many objections to cases beforehand. And maybe the last time that I'm talking, so I must say this, that social justice would have been impossible had it not been for voluntary organizations like FUL, like Section 27, like the Social Economic Rights Institute, and a whole range of organizations, and a lot of lawyers in private practice who do work for nothing, and many, many committed attorneys and people like Nicole and Umunyana, who, had they been in private practice, would have earned much more money than they do in the work which they do. So I think it is very important for us to record our thanks to all of them to make social justice possible. We will never have social justice completely. The Constitution aims at it, but we have a whole range of people who make a whole range of sacrifices to make these things happen. These organizations deliver an amazing service, and I must do the commercial here that these organizations are the route through which private enterprise can contribute to the achievement of a long-term public good, which will have phenomenal implications for our democracy in the future.
If you didn't understand that, it means donate. If you didn't understand that, it means that make social justice the cornerstone of your purpose as a corporate citizen. If you didn't understand that, it means as a corporate citizen care that a little boy drowned in a pit toilet. If you didn't understand that, it means care that many children are learning in dangerous and hazardous conditions, just circumstances that if any of us were to be exposed to, we would not even achieve anything. We would not even survive a day. That is a reality. It means you must care that many children in South Africa are walking long distances, crossing dangerous rivers to get to their classrooms. So that's what Justice Yaqub meant there. But going back to the politicians, we've seen the EFF laying charges against Pravin Gordhan. We've just been talking about the malice behind a prosecution, that it doesn't matter. If there's a case to answer, then one must answer. And on a political level, we're talking about the timing. We can speculate, we can analyze it. But I do want to talk about that, that particular case, but also juxtapose that with the Democratic Alliance, for example, approaching the courts in order to access the spy tapes. So nobody's saying that politicians cannot approach the courts, but there's got to be merit, and it is welcomed when it is for the greater good.
Absolutely. And of course, politicians must be able to access the courts. I think one has to take into account that sometimes politicians perhaps need to be a bit slower, that they have other mechanisms by which they can secure accountability. As parliamentarians, they have got the legislature and they must use those avenues. And it's when they are frustrated in those avenues that they should approach the court. So I think sometimes there has to be a burden on politicians to be a little more cautious than they sometimes are in rushing to the courts. But that said, I mean, to refer to the example which you spoke of, what we saw a case being lodged by the EFF, but even more worryingly, in this last week we saw the EFF protesting outside the Commission into State Capture. Now that commission, potentially... But it wasn't just a protest. There were all sorts of acerbic comments being directed at the judge, at certain witnesses. Of violence, which is incredibly worrying. So there was reference to the evidence leader several times as a bastard. There was, reference to the witness who was then appearing, Minister Pravin Gordhan, as a dog who needed to be beaten, a suggestion that lives would be lost in this fight. I think that those types of threats are enormously concerning, not only in respect to the Commission, where those types of threats have the potential to intimidate staff members from doing their jobs as robustly as possible, but also intimidating future witnesses who may not be as powerful as Minister Gordhan from coming forward and disclosing incriminating evidence. So I think when we see those types of threats, not just use of the courts in a specious fashion for spectacle to distract, but real threats at legal processes and intends to intimidate those processes, then we should be really concerned. And certainly we were, and I think a number of civil society organizations put out statements to that effect.
There's been reaction to that, and the Zondo Commission itself reacting, and the President actually reacting to that. But Umanyana, Judge Yaqub has just told us about the finances that are needed, the resources that are needed to keep organizations like yourself going. So it is exasperating when you see politicians approaching the courts when they have no prospect of winning. I'm thinking about the former Home Affairs Minister who petitioned the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court refused to hear his case. And then we have now the former SARS boss also petitioning Constitutional Court. So I guess the point that I'm making is the amount of money that is being wasted by powerful people, money that is not theirs often, those who hold public office, whereas, if they spend half of that money doing the job that they're supposed to do and their mandate, then you wouldn't need to be so active and be so desperate for resources.
That's right, and I think what's important as well is looking at the way in which government works and the wastage that happens. And I'll say in particular the wastage on lawyers. Lawyers are very expensive, and you find over and over again government departments briefing private lawyers and big law firms, spending millions and millions of rands. The creme de la creme of the legal fraternity. Absolutely, spending millions of rands either on consultants to do work that can be done internally, or on lawyers. And it's absolutely unacceptable. And again we get reports from the Auditor General that talks about this kind of wasteful expenditure. Billions of rands that is wasted within the system. And what we have to do is then try to address those things within the system. We don't have enough resources to do so. And we get told, no, we don't have the resources to provide health services, to build infrastructure in schools. We don't have the resources. Let's call on the private sector. But really what we have to demand is accountability for spending. And it's absolutely essential to look at those budgets. And we now have a budget analyst that looks very deeply at the spending, the budgeting, and looking at the larger budget as well, and start to have an influence on the way in which budgeting is done.
Indeed, it has to be rooted in social justice. And I think I might just add here, you mentioned the Auditor General, that there were some changes to his powers, and that the Auditor General's office will have more teeth, as it were. It's been years and years of the Auditor Generals, different Auditor Generals, telling us about the billions that have been lost at state-owned entities, municipalities, national government, and yet no consequences. We take a break.
Buildings, submerged homes and devastated families.
Biggest earthquake in here.
Their homes and buildings moved like boats.
Big shake, and I ran as fast as I can.
These are the satellite images depicting the area before the disaster.
The ground is like a wave.
I've never seen anything like this in my life.
It is unbelievable. You can actually smell the stench of dead bodies around.
The National Hurricane Center said earlier on Tuesday that Michael was a Category 1 storm with sustained winds of up to 150 kilometers per hour. Residents were implored to get out of harm's way ahead of life-threatening waves, winds and rains. Flash flooding over the weekend caused 13 deaths in Central America after Michael formed off the coast of northern Honduras.
SABC is independent and impartial, and it's important that as we deliver the news, we do so without fear, without favour, without prejudice, and that we ensure that we get the multiplicity of views so that our stories and coverage is balanced.
We pride ourselves on being impartial as well as independent. On the agenda, we basically break down the stories of the day, give it more substance and give it more detail. So all in all, we basically take the news agenda of the day forward.
But more than that, we'll be able to reflect the stories of ordinary folk, people who are trying to make ends meet, facing the most incredibly difficult obstacles and circumstances, and that they will find that their realities are expressed on the SABC.
To be a part of something like this makes me proud, and I think that to be able to report the news in a fair, just, independent and impartial way is what the public broadcaster stands for.
Welcome back. We are now in the final segment of the program. Thank you so very much for staying with us. We are going to be concluding our discussion in just a moment. Let me remind you that my guests this evening, Umanyana Rujeje, who is the Deputy Director of Section 27, Nicole Fritz, the CEO of Freedom Under Law, and in our Durban studios we have our guest, Justice Zach Yaqub, who of course is a former Constitutional Court judge. Okay, we're about to wrap up our discussion, but I do want to ask you, how can South Africans be more, I think, jealous and protective of their constitution? Because it really is the final arbiter. We've seen in Kolobeni, the ARV case, and I'm thinking about another historic case, the Grootboom case. It had to do with housing, but unfortunately by the time the judgment came, Mrs. Grootboom had passed away. But it stands as a pivotal moment in exercising the rights given to ordinary citizens by our constitution. And I think that is what I'd like our viewers to take with them, that I am a legitimate citizen. I do have rights. I may not be powerful. I may not have the economic might, but there is the sacrosanct supreme law that protects me.
Absolutely. And I think there has to be that sense of ownership and attachment to this constitution. And I think people need to find a voice. I understand that often, with so much inequality in this country, one can't pretend that we have equal access to courts, but that there are social justice organizations and that there are many of them. And one of the strengths, I think, of South Africa is our civil society, and that there are ways to approach organizations and to have these cases taken up. I think our judiciary has been another one of our strengths. I mean, we only have to look at the role that they played in terms of the social grants crisis, the importance, the fact that they were not going to countenance any interruption to social grants, that the poorest and most vulnerable amongst South Africans would go without their money. And so I think the fact is to make sure that one is, approaching organizations, if you do not have the means to do so yourself, and seeking to realize that constitution, because with every judgment, our constitution gets more expansive, it gets more generous, it gets richer and deeper.
And all thanks to Freedom Under Law and Black Sash on the SASA matter, knowing that so many South Africans depend on those particular grants. But Manyana, just very, very quickly, same question to you, but also talking about the relationship between organizations such as yourself and the government, because I often say we're not adversaries. If you work as your partners, you're grassroots, you can provide such rich expertise and assistance for the government itself. How would you assess that relationship as we close?
Sure, I agree with everything that Nicole said. And to answer your question, we have really good relationships with government officials that we work with. And sometimes we have to criticize, and sometimes we have to hold them to account. And they don't like that. But at the end of the day, we still come back to that relationship of professionalism, where we are part of a civil society that is important, that is an important part of governance. So government officials like the Director General of Health, Precious Matsoso, will say, I can't do my job without the society, without the community.
That's good to know.
People have to participate. And there's so many opportunities to participate in lawmaking, in discussions around national health insurance, in just being an active citizen in a way that you inform yourself and keep involved in some way or another. We're not there just to stand aside and say we represent. No, we are part of a society, and we want people to learn about the Constitution and to demand their rights. But also, lastly, I would like to say that people in their individual lives must speak truth to power. When they see inequality, they should
I've got to interrupt you. Judge Yaqub has about 40 seconds to speak. So, Judge Yaqub, final thoughts. Would you say we can proudly claim we are a constitutional democracy in practice?
We can proudly claim it, provided that we understand that the society contemplated by the Constitution has not yet been achieved.
Indeed.
All of us must embrace the values of the Constitution, start living them, start educating our people, start educating government, ensuring that the people do what they have to do, so that ultimately the constitutional order and its continuation will depend on what the people think, how the people act, and what their views are about their values and the way in which they embrace the Constitution. And hopefully one day, everybody in our... The trouble we have is that people... The Constitution says we are equal, but the majority of our people don't live the lives of total equality and total justice.
Okay.
Once everybody starts living those lives, I think that if we can say that these organizations need not exist in the future because we do have a truly constitutional order.
Okay.
We have reached a wonderful time. Yeah.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much to my wonderful guests, and thank you for watching Unfiltered this evening. We'll meet again next week. Do take care.